Honorable Senators, today we begin our study of Bill S-233, an act to develop a national framework for a guaranteed livable basic income. Sitting at our table, the sponsor, Senator Pate. We're joined this morning by former Premier of Ontario, Madame Kathleen Wynne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate all of you for inviting me to speak in support of Bill S-233. The idea of a guaranteed basic income for Canadians most in need of support is not a new one, and I think all of the senators recognize that. There's already a range of programs in place that provide that exact guarantee to certain groups in our society, but not all. The Guaranteed Annual Income System Supplement in Ontario is provided on top of old age security payment for seniors in need. The Ontario Child Benefit and the Federal Canada Child Benefit guarantee a supplement to families with children. The Canada Disability Benefit to be introduced will supplement provincial support. So those programs are already in place, and we see demonstrable benefits from those. When I became Premier of Ontario in 2013, our government was about to receive a report from Mr. Munir Sheikh and Francis Lankin, one of your colleagues, and they had done a review of our social assistance program because we were looking for ways to improve a system that was not working as it should. The task had been to recommend changes to make the system more rational, more dignified, more supportive of people, both who could enter the workforce, for example, to allow recipients to own more assets and earn more money, but still not lose benefits, and for those who could not enter the workforce. However, the authors were not asked to comment on the adequacy of social assistance programs. In other words, the amount of money that was received. I became increasingly concerned that our efforts would amount to no more than a sort of incrementalist approach around the edges of a system that had demonstrated that it already did not succeed in lifting people out of poverty. I had been impressed by the work done in Manitoba in the Mincome pilot in the 1970s, and I know Evelyn may talk more about that. And as a member of our government's Poverty Reduction Committee, we were tasked with providing input into our poverty reduction legislation. As Premier, I was looking for tangible improvements in people's lives as a result of a government program that would support involvement in community, including work placements, encourage school retention, and potentially support improved health outcomes. And those were all anecdotal benefits of the Mincome project. And I just want to say, having listened to the parliamentary budget officer, it's so clear that we do not look at the cost savings of having those benefits in place. So I don't think we can assess the impact of a guaranteed basic income unless we understand that there will be savings as a result of those improved lives. So those were exactly the kinds of outcomes that we were starting to see as a result of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot before it was canceled by the current Ford government in Ontario. And despite the fact that the current government had promised to maintain the pilot for the 3-year duration, it was not maintained, and so we did not get the evidence that we were looking for. I had turned in the setting up of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot to Hugh Siegel, your former colleague, to help us. We used the report that Hugh produced as a basis for the Ontario pilot, and in designing the pilot, we took a lot of care to attach real dollar amounts to the program so that the researchers would be able to draw concrete conclusions about the cost of the model. We budgeted a total of $50 million over 3 years to support 4,000 people, plus setup costs and evaluation and maintenance of health benefits for social assistance clients. It seemed to me that we had the evidence from the supplements that are already in place that I already enumerated, that such a system can work and can make a substantial difference in people's lives, while the social assistance programs in place for people of Ontario between the ages of 18 and 64 were often humiliating, inadequate. They were ineffective traps, keeping people from breaking out of intergenerational poverty. At the same time, we were grappling with the realities, and we still are, of technology displacing workers across all sectors of employment, of industry, commerce, and service. We have made a decision as a society that we are not interested in institutionalizing people, and yet we have not put the supports in place in the community that are needed. On a daily basis, we hear from cities, towns, villages across this country about homelessness, food insecurity crises that are not abating. So I think that right now the Canadian government has an opportunity to develop cross-jurisdictional supports for most vulnerable Canadians. I had always hoped that the Canadian government would work with us and other subnational jurisdictions who had expressed an interest to test the implementation of a guaranteed livable income as a national strategy, and that can happen now. We actually know that the cost of not putting these supports in place is visible to us. It's visible to us all socially, in terms of health outcomes, and in the reality of increasing income inequality. The Canadian government has the opportunity right now to lay out a transition to a better way. And I'm just going to bring Hugh Siegel into this because I know we are thinking of him, so many of us, and he would have loved to be here to have this conversation. From his book, Bootstraps Need Boots, he says, simply put, my life experience has shown me that poverty is a cause of much of the dysfunction that our societies need to address. It is not rocket science to figure out that someone can live a better life at 70% of the poverty line than at 45%, or that a basic income design that encourages work will be more helpful for a dynamic and growing society than a welfare regime that discourages it. There are people sitting in your committee room today, because I've seen them on my screen, who benefited from the basic income, who got back into work, who were able to put themselves back into the community in a good way. And I believe that we have an opportunity right now to look at the entire picture of what a program like this could offer to people in this country. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Is Professor Forget, please be followed by Professor Zhao.
Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. This bill that we're considering today specifically addresses adults of working age, that is, people between 18 and 64. This is a really challenging group to talk about, and many people wonder whether it might not be better to introduce good job training programs and labor market policies that lead to better wages and working conditions than to take a chance on a basic income that might discourage people from working. We know that the best empirical evidence out there suggests that a well-designed basic income will not substantially reduce the number of hours worked. Some people have argued that it will increase the hours worked or move people into better jobs. We've just seen that the PBO estimated a reduction in the number of hours worked of only 1.5% at most. However, what I'd like to argue is that we need both better labor market policies and a basic income. Not everyone can work at a regular job that pays enough to allow them to live above the poverty line. Some people have disabilities and receive disability support, but many people with disabilities don't qualify for such support, particularly those with recurring disabilities, or including especially mental health conditions. Other people simply don't have the job skills that would pay a living wage. Some of those people can be retrained, but clearly not all. Sometimes there are no jobs to be had because the Bank of Canada has taken particular policies, or there's no transportation to the jobs that do exist. Other people have personal responsibilities and limitations that make regular paid employment impossible. Some people have lived with such devastating personal and generational trauma that they have to do a great deal of work on themselves before they're ready to work for anyone else. I was at an event on October 4th at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights on behalf of missing and murdered Indigenous women that reminded me once again of how many Canadians have lived on incomes between $6,000 and $10,000 a year for most of their lives. Few people who've lived on the streets for any stretch of time can expect to take a short job training course and become employable at a job that pays a living wage. So you look at that kind of evidence and you wonder whether what we actually need are social programs designed to address the very special needs of marginalized groups instead of a basic income. And again, the answer to that is that we need both specific social programs and we need a basic income. We need treatment for people who use substances. We need harm reduction policies, mental health services. We need all kinds of supports. But it's really hard for people to take advantage of these policies when they don't have a full belly and a roof over their heads, shelter from the cold. I live in Winnipeg, which has the largest Indigenous population of any city in Canada. Many of the absolutely essential social programs we have in place struggle a lot to be perceived as something other than colonial overreach. There isn't a lot of trust among the population, and coercing people into a job training program or addiction treatment programs in order to meet their most basic needs is both ineffective and demeaning. The stability that a basic income introduces into people's lives allows them to take advantage of these social programs on their own terms to move forward to benefit their own lives. Now, I think many people recognize that a basic income might be a beneficial policy, but they wonder if we can afford it. They wonder if this is the right time to be talking about a basic income. Years ago, I looked at the Mincome Project, which took place in Manitoba in the mid-1970s. That project ended in 1978 as it was planned. The results were very positive. The researchers wanted to continue the project. But instead, they were told to archive the data because times were tough. At the end of the 80s, we were looking at high interest rates. We were looking at high inflation rates. It just wasn't the right time. A few years later, the MacDonald Commission, which reported in 1984, recommended a guaranteed income. We got NAFTA, but the guaranteed income got sidelined because, again, 1984, times were tough. It wasn't the right time to talk about a guaranteed income. I'd just like to end by suggesting that times are always tough. The economy is always in crisis, or it's about to fall into crisis, or it's just emerging from a crisis. We have an opportunity to look beyond the immediate future, to make plans over a long period of time that can transform people's lives, transform the kind of society we live in. And I think we have to remember especially that hard times are always hardest for those who have the least. We need a basic income, and I would urge you to look at this bill carefully and to talk to people, talk to a wide range of people who can help to bring together a good project design for a basic income that can make a real difference in the kind of society we live in. Thank you.
Professor Zhao, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me today. As a cognitive scientist, I've studied how humans perform in the conditions of scarcity. My work has shown the detrimental cognitive tax of poverty, and that is, our cognitive function declines when we experience poverty, equivalent to a 13-point drop in IQ. Now, this drop is equivalent to aging 15 years from 45 to 60 years old. My colleagues' work has also shown that poverty makes workers less productive and more prone to errors at work. In fact, a growing body of studies have shown a psychological trap of poverty. That is, poverty saps brain power, making it more difficult to escape poverty. Giving people cash is one of the most effective and cost-effective ways to reduce poverty. Basic income provides not only the critical financial resources to low-income individuals, but also freedom and dignity. My team at UBC and Foundations for Social Change have recently published a peer-reviewed article at the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where we show that giving $7,500 to people experiencing homelessness in Vancouver, BC, improved their cognitive function and well-being within 3 months of the cash transfer. Over 1 year, these recipients reduced homelessness by 99 days, and the reduced reliance on social services generated a savings of $8,277 per person per year, and that is a net savings of $777 per person per year. We also found that the cash transfer did not lead to increased spending on alcohol, drugs, and cigarettes. Instead, the cash transfer reduced substance use severity by 90% in our recipients. The cash was primarily spent on food, rent, transit, and durable goods. We've heard from our participants that this cash transfer gave them peace of mind so that they can think properly and make good decisions for themselves and for their family. Our study is not the first one to show the benefits of cash transfers. In fact, hundreds of cash transfers around the world have demonstrated the same pattern of results: improved well-being, improved health conditions, cognitive function, and food security. And in some cases, cash transfers led to reduced crime rate and reduced alcohol and substance use. We're currently expanding the cash transfer study in British Columbia so that they can benefit more people and lifting people out of homelessness on a larger scale. We want to scale up the project to benefit more low-income individuals, as well as demonstrating that this can work in other regions in British Columbia. The need to raise the income floor has never been greater. Since more people are being displaced by the rising living costs and the devastating environmental disasters in Canada. In a recent national survey, 50% of Canadians are pessimistic about their personal finances. A quarter of the low-income households cannot pay for monthly expenses. This presents tremendous stress on people's mind, increasing the risks of a downward spiral into deep poverty, which will only cost us more. Bill S-233 aims to provide a guaranteed livable basic income to all Canadians. This can not only alleviate the financial strains, but unleash the vast human potential that's currently trapped by poverty. A livable basic income can make Canadians more productive members of the society and generate net savings for the government over the long term. This is a true investment in Canadians. In this spirit, we're actively looking at designing a guaranteed livable basic income project in Prince George, BC, with support from Mayor Simon Yu, Indigenous leaders, and stakeholders in the province. So in closing, I strongly urge the government to test the implementation of a guaranteed livable basic income as a national strategy to reduce the economic, social, and human costs of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, honorable senators. We will now move immediately for questions, and the first round will be for 5 minutes.
I'm going to start with Ms. Wynne because you've lived the experience. Yeah. So was there ever an evaluation of the program or an interim evaluation? Because it seems like that's what we're lacking in a lot of these cases.
Well, we had hoped, Senator, and in the election in 2018, the opposition party at the time said that they would continue the pilot, but as soon as the Ford government was elected, they canceled it in the first years. I'm sorry to tell you that we don't have the statistical evidence. What we do have is anecdotal evidence, Senator.
Yes, that was my next question. Do you have? Yes.
Absolutely. You know, I visited with people who, during the time that I was still premier, I visited with people who were on the basic income, and then after the program was canceled, I became part of the conversation with people who had the experience. And what we found was exactly what both the other panelists have talked about. We found that people were more motivated and more able to get into the workplace. I met with a man, for example, who was able to get his car back on the road and get back into work. He had to leave the workforce to look after his mom, had fallen into poverty and had gotten stuck. And when the basic income pilot came along, he was able to actually get back into the workforce. I met young people who were able to buy some clothes in order to be able to apply for jobs and also go back to school. So it's all anecdotal, but we did see the kinds of movement and the kind of security and calm that came from having just that extra bit of cash. You know, it was $17,000 a year. It's not a lot of money that was given to each recipient, but it was enough that the worries about putting food on the table and having something to wear to work and having transportation to get to work started to be less of an issue.
Okay, thank you. is there a fear that once you provide additional financial assistance, that they could lose other benefits? And I'm thinking of things like a drug card. Once you get to a certain income level, you would lose your drug card, which is very, very important to people receiving financial assistance. So could you talk about that aspect of the incentive not to work? Can you just address that concern?
Professor Forget, comment? Professor Zhao also?
Yeah, I'll just echo that if I can. I think that no one sees a basic income as a program that's just pasted on top of all of the other programs. The existing programs already have a lot of contradictions built into them. And so what basic income does is it gives us an opportunity to clean out a lot of those programs and to make sure that they work together.
This issue of the guaranteed basic income being a disincentive for work.
Yeah, so for the working disincentive argument, the empirical evidence argues otherwise. Actually, basic income has increased employment in certain demographics. In a currently running Denver project, basic income has increased full-time employment by 50%. So that's what the evidence says.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much for being with us this morning, witnesses. To Madame Forget. 10% of Canadians or so don't file for income tax. The people who are in the most fragile, the most vulnerable in society certainly don't. In that light, given the CERB that was made available to the public, what are the advantages of a guaranteed basic income?
I would say first that basic income does not need to be delivered through the tax system. That's one option, but there are other ways of delivering a basic income. For example, if there were a cooperation between the provinces and the federal government, there's a lot of machinery at the provincial level that can be drawn on to deliver a basic income. So this is part of the design of a project. How do we do that? In terms of tax filing, I think that a lot of people don't file tax returns because it's not worth their while to file tax returns. Now, it's true that many very marginalized people don't get the benefits that they should be getting because they don't file tax returns. But I think that there are a lot of efforts put into place right across the country to increase that. For example, there was a political decision on a lot of reserves not to become involved in the tax system for all kinds of reasons. When the Canada Child Benefit was substantially increased in 2016, a lot of effort was made to ensure that people received the Canada Child Benefit, which was delivered through the tax system. And that was done both through a concerted effort to make sure that the people who should be filing are filing, to make sure that that information was available. But CRA also developed a simple one-page attestation of income. I can't remember the number offhand, but it became very, very convenient and very possible for people to file income taxes under those circumstances. So I think we have to look a whole lot at how we can improve that system if we're going to use the tax system to deliver benefits. I think that can be part and parcel of designing a basic income and asking ourselves how best to get it into people's hands.
Question for Dr. Zhao. The recipients in your study generally represented a third of the homeless population in Vancouver, and it was noted they were mild users of substance, had mild psychiatric symptoms. Just wondering if you looked at all at more of the risk population so that you would have had a total study. And I'm just thinking of the higher users of substance, psychiatric problems, etc. Have you done any further research to try to get that groups, which possibly would give you a higher degree of credibility when you're talking to people who would be resistant to trying to implement such a program?
That's a good question. So we looked at individuals with moderate levels of use, just not severe levels of use. In fact, a lot of our participants have active addiction, substance use issues currently. We are expanding the project to see how the cash transfer will generalize to the broader population, but we have not included people with severe mental health or substance use challenges at this point. Now, I think the motivation for that question is to understand the potential risks of cash transfers to people with severe levels of substance use or mental health symptoms. My answer to that is this cash transfer is unlikely to increase the risks of cash on these individuals because they already have access to cash as the welfare programs that currently exist. $7,500 or basic income is not going to lead to overdose or increasing overdose because it really takes $10 or even less to overdose. It does not depend on the amount of cash they receive. Second, past studies past basic income programs around the world have shown that basic income actually reduced reliance on alcohol and substance over time. And that evidence comes from the Cherokee Nation in North Carolina. Over 11 years, the basic income in that community actually reduced alcohol and substance use. And that speaks to the other side of the puzzle, which is people use because they're in poverty or homelessness, not the other way around.
Madam Forget, I'm just wondering if you, as you look at this, and there's so many individuals who are trying to do good things in this program or potential program, I guess a simple question that sort of strikes me is, how do you mobilize people from all the different parts or geographic places in our country who are really concerned and have some fantastic ideas in their mind? How do you mobilize this group to set up? And I know that Senator Pate's doing this with the bill, but how do you mobilize that population out there of people who are leaders who are going to say, hey, let's get this thing organized properly so that people can't say no to us?
Probably the hardest question you could ask me. I think that one of the real limitations of the system we have is that there are literally hundreds of programs across the country.
Right.
Some of them are simple cash transfers, some of them are combinations of services and transfers, some are services. They're all run by people in their own little silo, in a sense, and everybody thinks that they've got the answer to whatever it is we're doing. I think that one of the things that is becoming more commonly recognized across the system is that these problems are all interrelated. You know, if we're trying to deal with the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, we can't do it without looking at a whole range of other issues that impact on people's lives. If we're looking at issues of addiction, of substance use, we can't do it without looking at poverty, at homelessness, and at all of the things that go along with it. And I think that one of the things that we see at its core is that poverty actually requires money. You actually have to get money into people's hands so that they can make decisions. And it really does simplify, in some ways, the possibility of those people who fall between the gaps in the programs, those people who aren't compliant, those people who don't fit into the programs that are set up. What cash does is it allows them to make their own decisions and come to the programs and make use of them the way that they can. So I think that a basic income is foundational. How we get to that, I think we are moving towards it, but the progress is a whole lot slower than I'd like to see.
Senator Pate, to be followed by Senator Wu. Senator Pate, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our witnesses for your lifetimes of work on this and so many other issues. I'd like to pick up on Senator Smith's question. And my question for each of you, maybe in the order that you presented, starting with Premier Wynne and then with Dr. Forget, Dr. Zhao and Dr. Forget, is why now, and how would this assist people to deal with the current crises we're seeing? You mentioned environmental crises, financial crises. You mentioned homelessness and poverty that we're seeing. You've mentioned that we have looked at staged models from the child benefits to guaranteed income supplements, now the disability benefit. We know that Quebec and BC have said not a full thing, but let's do it in incremental ways. What's really holding us back? If you can expand more on what each of you were just saying, and why is it that we're seeing the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, for instance, the status of women? Others clearly go to this kind of approach, and yet governments balk at it. maybe start with you, Premier Wynne. You didn't, I know, but.
So the what's holding us back, I think it was interesting what Professor Forget said, that times are always tough, that whenever we propose, and I'm reminded when we in Ontario said we were going to raise the minimum wage to $14, 4 years before, business had said it's not the right time. 4 years later, when the economy was better in 2017, they said the time's not right. So I think there's always going to be an argument that this is too expensive, we can't afford it, the time's not right. I would suggest to you that some of the issues that we've already raised, that you just enumerated, are reaching crisis proportions, and that we have tried a lot of things that haven't worked. And now I think it's time to try something that we actually know does work. Putting money in people's hands. I mean, both Professor Zhao and Professor Forget have talked about the realities of that in other programs. We saw it in Ontario. And so I think it's time that we use what we know and design a program that we know is going to help.
I think one of the things that strikes me right now is that many of our social programs out there are laboring under excess demands. They're barely coping. I am on the board of a community financial counseling services, and we're running through counselors. We're burning out our counselors because they're dealing with problems, and massive problems that they've never had to face before. That's true in my sector. It's true for food banks. It's true for every organization I can point to. We are reaching a crisis position. We have to make some decisions going forward. I am a bit of a historian, and I've been doing healthcare for a long time. And one of the things that really comes to mind over and over again when we talk about basic income are some of the battles that led up to the introduction of Medicare over the years. And I think sometimes that crisis gives you an opportunity to do better things. But I think we also need to be able to look beyond the next election cycle. This short-term perspective, this notion that times are tough right now, we'll just boot it forward and somebody can deal with it 5 years from now. The next regime can answer the questions. Things can happen over and over again. I think we have to bring a longer-term perspective and start asking about how our society would be different if we put in place a basic income today.
There is an emergency of homelessness and crisis in Canada. The reason the homelessness count in Vancouver shows there's a 32% increase in the homeless population, while the entire population of Vancouver only increased 3%. So the current approaches are failing, and failing significantly, so we need to try something different. Basic income is a rational investment to reduce homelessness and poverty effectively. The biggest pushback I've heard is increases in taxes, that people think it's not fair to use my tax dollars to pay for the poor. The reality is that that's not the case. If we implement basic income, it would only affect the top maybe 5% of the income earners. It won't impact the taxes of the vast majority of Canadians. That's number one. Number two is basic income actually reduces our taxpayers' money. It's cost effective overall. It's less than what we currently spend on poverty.
Thank you very much. Do I have time for a short?
No, three seconds. So,
Okay.
so Senator Wu to be followed by the Senator Lofreda. Senator Wu,
Chair.
please.
Thank you, former Premier Wynne. Thank you, Professors Zhao and Forget. There's a body of analysts, particularly economists, who've studied this issue and who would likely share, I'm sure they would share your concern about poverty, homelessness, people who are displaced for various reasons. They would share perhaps also your findings on the beneficial effects of cash transfers, but who might say that a targeted approach is better than a universal basic income. This is basically the thesis of both the Quebec study and the BC study. So I'd like you to talk a bit more about why you are advocating universality. And I know there are different ways to calibrate that, but why don't we just do a more targeted approach? Find the people in the downtown east side, all of them, and give them the cash transfer, but don't give it to anyone else. Perhaps Dr. Zhao can start, followed by Professor Forget and former Premier Wynne.
Thank you, Senator. the targeted approach are both ineffective and inefficient. It ended up costing us more over the long run, because that's what we are currently doing. And what we see, this is not working at reducing poverty or homelessness. A basic income is more effective and cost-effective over the long run. That's my short answer. But I can pass it over to Evelyn to speak to the more specifics.
I think I agree with that absolutely. It's not an efficient way of dealing with things. The more targeted programs you introduce, the more gaps you introduce into the system. The more gaps there are, the more opportunities there are for people to slide through, to not quite fit. Basic income is a more universal approach, so everybody can get access to at least some supports. So I think that's one answer. I am an economist, and I understand the criticism, the idea. I think if you're dealing with a small problem, a targeted approach is appropriate. I think we're not dealing with a small problem. We're dealing with a lot of interrelated problems, and I think that targeted approaches simply don't work under that kind of a setting. I think we need something bigger than that. We need better ways of integrating what we have out there.
Yes, Ms. Wynne?
Yeah, so I'm not a researcher like the other two professors. And, you know, we in Ontario, we went for a program that identified a population that would be eligible. And I guess my response, Senator Wu, is that there are different models. There are different models within the frame of universal. And I think that that's exactly why this legislation is important, that we need to look at those models, work with people like Professor Forget and Professor Zhao, and figure out how to design a program that does not exclude, but includes everybody who needs to be included.
If I have a bit more time.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying, which is that the leakage that comes from a universal program, because some people will get it that maybe you feel don't need to get it, the leakage is less than the leakage of the targeted program, so we're better off with the universal program. I get that. This bill doesn't actually call for the implementation of basic income or guaranteed livable basic income. It calls for the construction of a framework, a national framework. In your opinion, what should this framework constitute? What are some concrete ideas that a framework could put in place so that we can move forward even if it's in an incremental manner? Professor Zhao, would you like to start?
Yep. So I think the ideas behind the framework are to establish the principles. What are the conditionalities? Establishing the parameters on requirements, who would be qualified or eligible for this program, at what costs, what benefits. So I think establishing these core principles of basic income are crucial. Now, the actual implementation will vary depending on the province and territory. So I think that's what the framework should say, is giving us the principles.
Thank you.
Yeah, we heard this morning from the parliamentary budget officer that a basic income has a lot of parameters. And I think that an opportunity to study it is an opportunity to bring people together from a lot of different sectors, to bring the provinces together, to bring federal representatives together, to bring nonprofits in, and to talk about what those parameters should be. And I mean, there are a couple that are sort of favorites to my mind. I think that we've approached the design of basic income with a certain lack of imagination. I think one of the most important things is to look at the definition of the family and the implications of different ways of defining the family, the benefit unit, and delivering the program.
And the main concern with respect to guaranteed basic livable income is not only the increase in taxes and costs, but it could lead to a disincentive to work, which leads to scarce resources, leads to inflation, and will hinder the same people we are trying to help. And Dr. Forget, you mentioned that guaranteed basic livable income will increase hours worked and not disincentivize work. And I would welcome additional insight on those comments and conclusive findings on what you may have on that, and comments from other panelists are welcome on those findings or conclusions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The whole work disincentive issue, my opinion is that a basic income has very little impact on the amount of hours worked. I believe that that's going to be the finding. There was a question about Finland, the Finnish experiment, a little while ago. They began that experiment with the hypothesis that people who received a basic income would work more hours than people who didn't receive a basic income. They didn't find that. They found absolutely no difference between the control group and the subjects. I talked to the director of that program, Ollie Kangas, and he told me something very interesting, though. Towards the end of the project, he did find a difference, not in terms of the number of hours worked, but in terms of the kinds of jobs that the subjects found relative to the control group. The control group, to the extent that they were still working the sort of temporary, handing out leaflets kind of jobs that they'd been working before the project came along. What happened to the subjects is that some of them were moving into real jobs, jobs that continued over time and that they would expect to see improve their lives. That didn't show up statistically, partly because the project wasn't long enough to see it. So I'd like to see those kinds of long-term impacts. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't believe that there's any evidence at all that a basic income either incentivizes or disincentivizes work. I don't think you're going to see a huge difference between the two. If you introduce a basic income, people aren't going to flee the job market. They haven't in any of the experiments we've put in place. They haven't when we've introduced basic income-like programs. When we introduced the Canada Child Benefit, mothers worked more, not less. So I just don't think that there's going to be a huge difference out there. What I meant to say when I was presenting was that some people seem to think it was going to increase labor market participation. Some people seem to think it's going to reduce it. I don't think there's any difference, and I don't think there's any evidence to support the notion that it's going to create much of a difference. I think the PBO was quite correct to use as a first estimate a 1.5% reduction in the number of hours worked when they did their report. That's a very, very small amount. It's an appropriate choice to make.
Honorable Senators, our second panel, and to the witnesses, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, your ideas, and your visions with the Finance Committee. And on this, je déclare maintenant la séance, the meeting is now adjourned, Honorable Senators.